Welcome, everybody. Today I have a very special guest. We have Bob Tiede here, and we're going to be talking about the art of asking questions. Would you like to say hello, Bob?
Hey, it's so great to be with you, Enoch. I've been looking forward to this.
Oh, I really am too. See, Bob has published 5 ebooks about asking questions, and he's done Now That's a Great Question, the 339 questions that Jesus asked, and a big book of leading with questions. And so many of these I've read, and his blog, leadingwithquestions.com, is followed by both secular and faith based audience and leaders in more than 190 countries around the world. And he is committed to helping leaders to shift their mindset from having the pressure of having all the answers to simply having just a few of the right questions. And I'm telling you, his content has changed my life. And Bob, my life has not and will never be the same again because of the messages and coming in contact with the content you put together and you've compiled about asking questions. It was back in 2017, maybe the beginning of 2018, that I first came in contact with your ebook, and that was the first introduction I had to the power of asking questions and how incredibly powerful it is. And since then, I've realized that the quality of our life comes down to the quality of the questions that we ask. So I look at you as one of the first mentors that I've had that have radically transformed my leadership. And,
Wow.
and I'm so excited to have you on our show to be able to introduce you to our audience so that you can change your life as well.
Enoch, I had no idea. That is so encouraging. Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And I over the years, I love to teach what I learn. So I've been teaching about asking questions and been training leaders,
Mm.
and your book is literally the first step that I always go to. And for anyone being introduced to asking questions and knowing how to do that, I'm just like, go to Bob Tiede, leadingwithquestions.com, and go get his books, his audiobooks, devour it, listen to it again, a second time, a third time, a fourth time, and you will not recognize your life afterwards. So I'm glad to have you here. So speaking of which, in your new book, you start Now That's a Great Question. You start with a confession. So what exactly are you confessing?
Well, thanks for asking. Whenever I speak, I start with a confession, and the confession is that for most of my career, I was a benevolent dictator. People could think Bob has a blog leading with questions. Bob's written a book on leading with questions. This must just come naturally to Bob. And I say, oh, I wish it did, but no. What comes naturally to Bob is let me tell you. But that changed for me. Well, I said I was a benevolent dictator. My only paradigm of leadership was that a leader needs to tell staff what to do, a leader needs to give direction. And I did say benevolent. I grew up in a home, Enoch, where I was taught to say please and thank you. So if you'd been on my team, I don't think I would have ever said, Enoch, go do this. It would have been more like, hey, Enoch, this week we're working on this. It'd really be great if you could please do this. And when you did it, I would have said, Enoch, thank you. Or at a staff meeting, even, Enoch, you stand up. You all need to hear what Enoch did this week. And I don't want to suggest that we got nothing done, but I am confessing my only paradigm of leadership is that leaders need to tell staff what to do. And for me, I think that changed in 2006 when I discovered this book, also called Leading with Questions by Dr. Michael Marquardt. And, perhaps like you, I love books. I eat books for breakfast, so to speak. And, in almost every leadership book I've ever read, there's a morsel in there of a takeaway. But I had no idea when I bought this book that it would not only change my leadership forever, it would actually provide a new direction of what I was doing. But what I loved about the book is it was filled with stories of leaders literally from around the globe, not just Americans, but leaders from everywhere who were leading with questions, and it shares the questions they were asking. And as I read this, my only question was, why hasn't anyone ever shared this with me before? Perhaps like you had when you encountered the first book. And so I embraced it and began to move down that path. And, and I start with this confession because, again, people could think, well, that must come naturally to Bob. No, but if I can change, so can everyone else.
Wow, that is really powerful, and it's so true. I remember the first time that you shared, I have a confession to make, and and I was like, what is he talking about? And he's like, well, I'm Bob, and I'm a teller,
Yeah.
I have a telling problem, and just the contrast that you made between leaders who tell and leaders who ask, I realized as you're sharing this story, I'm like, I have a telling problem too. I've been going about this wrong the entire time. And it's amazing because a lot of times in the beginning of your journey of asking questions, even like I realize that even when I'm like attempting to ask a question, I'm still making statements. And I'm like, wait, how could I shift that around? What could I do to change that? And your resources were invaluable. I remember one of the lessons that I learned from your books was ask a question followed by silence. And you said the longer the silence, generally more thoughtful the response. And
Oh.
I was just like, what? Because that gave me so much freedom. I would literally repeat that on a repeat sometimes in my mind when I'm asking a question in the silence. What was really like 3 seconds felt like 3 minutes. And
Oh.
I was just
Well,
like, the
Enoch,
longer the silence, the more thoughtful the response.
yeah. I just got done sharing with a group this morning in Sacramento, and one of the tips I shared with them is the 8 second rule.
Mm.
And I asked this question: what sport has an 8 second clock? Uh, might you know, Enoch, or recall?
I'm not sure. I'm not
As
much
soon
into
as I
sports.
mention it, you'll say, of course.
Okay.
Bull riding.
Bull riding. Oh, wow.
A
That makes sense.
professional bull rider has to stay on the bull for 8 seconds for a qualified ride. Now, we can think of 8 seconds as being like nothing. To a bull rider, 8 seconds is an eternity.
Yeah.
And of course, as I share that, these leaders are scratching their head and thinking, well, what's that have to do with leading with questions? And I share that for the average person, and this isn't conscious, we just do this unconsciously. We'll ask a question, but the silence so bothers us, it seems like an eternity. After 2 or 3 seconds, if they don't answer, in other words, if we don't start hearing words in the air, the average person will either re-ask the question, ask a different question, answer the question themselves, or just move on with no self-awareness. And so I say the 8 second rule is ask a question and then relax. Keep comfortable eyesight, not intense, and count to yourself 1001, 1002. There are times, as you've said, I get to 1030. The longer the silence, the better the answer. Now, Enoch, some of your listeners are actually not going to like this tip because you see, up to now they've been unaware, like I was. But they're going to ask a question of somebody later today, and when they don't answer in 2 or 3 seconds, they're going to start talking, and then they're going to remember the tip, and they're going to say, "Oh, I wish he hadn't shared that because now I'm aware." But I want to, it's another confession. I still do that from time to time. But here's what I've learned to do when I don't give people time to think. I call a timeout, say, my bad. Enoch, I asked you a question. I didn't even give you time to think the answer. My bad. Forgive me. Let me ask the question again. And this time I will remain silent, give you all the time you need to answer. And so that's your workaround. If you find yourself speaking too quickly, just call a timeout on yourself, a foul on yourself, and it'll work.
That is so good and so encouraging because it's true, it's easy to slip sometimes. And you mentioned something that it was a question I want to ask you because it seems like we are so naturally inclined to just tell people things. And a lot of times when we're trying to come up with questions, sometimes it's just a blank. So I ask you, do you believe that asking questions is something that you're born with naturally, or is it like a skill that anybody can develop? And why would you say that?
A fabulous question, Enoch. my perspective is there may be a few people born with it, but I think very few. Now, one exception is we can go there in a while. The Lord Jesus, I believe, was born with it,
Yeah.
but I wasn't. And I can move from being I sometimes express it this way: if I can move from Enoch, let me tell you, to Enoch, let me ask you.
Hmm.
Well, so can anyone else. And I also think, so many times we think that, wow, if I'm going to learn to lead with questions, I'll have to get a master's degree in questionology. In other words, we imagine that there's this enormous mountain that has to be climbed. And just like this morning, I shared with that group, I said, who here would like to learn to lead with questions in 30 seconds? I see Enoch's hand.
I do.
And, uh, and I always say, let's see if this is possible. And, uh, and like this morning, I picked a guy and said, hey, I chose you because I think you have a photographic memory. Of course, he shook his head. He didn't have a photographic memory. I said, I think you do. I think all you have to do is hear my 4 favorite questions one time and you'll have them memorized. And then we found a guy with a second hand to be the timer, but I have a second hand here. So, Enoch, I'm going to share my 4 favorite questions. I'm going to ask you if you have them memorized. If you say yes, I'm going to say share them with us, and we'll see if we can get this done in less than 30 seconds.
Let's do it.
Enoch, my first question is, what do you think? Second, what else? Third, what else? Fourth, what else? Enoch, do you have them memorized?
I got them memorized, Bob.
Share them with us.
Bob, what do you think? And that's the first. Second, what else? Third, what else? And fourth, what else? Followed by
Oh my
silence.
goodness. I'm going to have to change that question to who here would like to learn to lead with questions in 18 seconds?
That is so true. 30 seconds is an
Enoch,
overstatement.
when I share that though, some people look a little skeptical, like, Bob, you can't ask somebody, what do you think? What else? What else? What else? And I say, well, of course not in that rapid fashion. And when I say, what do you think? It's going to be about something. So, Annie, what do you think about we ought to do about this opportunity? Or what do you think we might do about this challenge? Or what do you think we might do? You tag something.
Hmm.
And when you ask, well, the person's going to give you an answer. And when they pause, instead of just moving on like I asked and they answered, you then, voice inflection is very important here. You'd say like, wow, Enoch, that's really good. What else? And the amazing thing is people will then give you more. I say all of us subconsciously, we protect ourselves. So when somebody says, Bob, hey, what do you think about? And the first answer we instinctively roll out is kind of a safe answer to see how they treat it. So, Enoch, if I asked you, hey, what do you think we ought to do about, and you give me an answer, and my response is, well, Enoch, that's stupid. Everyone knows that. Well, then you're sorry you answered.
And I won't want to
Next
speak up
time,
again.
yeah, next time you won't answer at all. But when I say, wow, Enoch, that's really good. What else? Well, you relax a little and think, wow, Bob's appreciating this, and you share more.
Yeah.
And then when you pause again, instead of just moving on, I may pull out a pen and say, Enoch, I've got to take notes. This is gold. Please continue. Say more about this. Well, now you're thinking, this Bob guy's smarter than I thought he was. He really appreciates what I'm sharing. And what I've discovered is you actually get to the gold nugget, their very best thought, with the third and fourth question. And I realized in the past, even when I did ask, hey, what do you think we ought to do about something? After that first answer, I just moved on. And, we've all heard the story. It's probably just a story, but the story of the proverbial gold miner who mines for gold all his life, never finds the gold vein, finally quits. Somebody comes along later and discovers he was within 6 inches of the gold vein. Well, if you only ask the first question, hey, what do you think? And you don't do the digging of the what else and what else, you're like that gold miner. You got close, but you never got the gold nugget. And Enoch, the promise to begin with here was who would like to learn to lead with questions in 30 seconds? And what I love about leading with questions is so many of the best questions are so simple.
Hmm.
They're not long, complicated things. And for a leader who says, "Man, Bob, I've been a teller. I don't lead with questions." Well, imagine your next staff meeting, either one on one with a staff member or with your staff at the conference table, by just instead of saying, "Hey, gang, let me tell you," I say, "Hey, let me ask you, what do you think we might do about whatever the issue or topic is on the table?" And then listen. And when they pause, say, "Wow, that's really good. Say more. What else?" And when they pause, say, "Wow, I'm taking notes. Please continue. Say more about that." Well, that person, that leader will have moved from "let me tell you" to being a leader who says, "let me ask you." And, there's some more questions, but it's that simple, Enoch.
Wow, that makes so much sense. And it sounds like what you're saying is asking questions is simple, but we go to work to complicate it.
Yeah.
And that what else has been so transformational for me. I've used it in so many different contexts with people, and I could see why that'd be your favorite because it is so simple to just ask what else and then listen. It reminds me of a line that you have in one of your books. I read it and it just hit me, like it just pierced my heart. It said, "Any fool can ask the first question, but it takes wisdom to ask the follow-up question." And I was like, I just took, like, you took asking questions to a whole new level because sure, I was asking the first question, but it's the follow-up question. So you helped me to shift my focus from the beginning to seeing what else or digging deeper, because it seems like a lot of times the surface answers, the first answers, are really not the juiciest or even like the most raw or the most helpful. It's kind of testing the waters, but when you show that affirmation and appreciation, what gets rewarded gets repeated, they start digging deeper. And I love that gold analogy. You've got so many great tools and tips and testimonies. I love this. So when it comes to a question that I love to ask people, and especially my mentors, in fact, I personally wrote a book called "I Want a Mentor, Now What Do I Do?" And it's teaching, yeah, it's teaching
Yeah.
people, and it's a question, right?
Yes.
And it's
Love it.
teaching people how to find mentors. And a method that I teach is Take Me to Your Mentor method, where I ask my mentors, who mentored you? So I'm going to ask you, when it comes to asking questions, who mentored you? Who was some of the most influential leaders who have really shifted your paradigm and your mindset when it comes to the skill of asking questions?
Well, there are two in particular, and a guy who's really been my lifelong mentor. When I say lifelong, I don't mean from birth on, but from 1980 to now. And I consider him the wisest man I've ever met. Is a guy named Bob Tiede. And what's unique about Bob is he spells Bob Bobb. And I've met a lot of Bob spelled like me, Bob, but he's the only one. Maybe there's others, but the only one I've ever known, the Bobb. And and he's the first one. When I met him the first time, he said, "Bob, I have kind of an unusual hobby. It's something I collect. Could you guess what I collect?" Well, coins, stamps, you know, I'm thinking of a collection. And he kind of, shakes his head and said, "No, I collect questions."
Mm.
And it was like, I mean, at the time, I didn't really comprehend. I didn't understand all of this, didn't really comprehend. And he said, the thing about questions is, first of all, they don't need to be original with you. You don't need to, draft an original question. He said, you can steal them, borrow them, making them your own. He said, pay attention to, like, when you do ask a question, if somebody says, "Wow, Bob, that's a great question," make sure you write it down then so you can use it in the future. And he always said, one of his, I don't know if I can give this quote word for word, but it was like, questions are like the intricate brass keys that unlock the lock boxes of the mind. And I just love the way he put that together. But he was the first one that alerted me to the value of asking questions. And then the second one is the author of Leading with Questions. And I did not know Dr. Michael McCord. He was professor at George Washington University, but it's probably a longer story and we have time, but he has now become a close personal friend. And so just his influence in my life also, um, those two things have been the mentors on this topic of leading with questions. And I imagine there's a whole bunch of others. On my blog now, 10 years into it, I think there's been over three or 400 guest post authors. And I've been privileged to excerpt from something like 70 different books, all related to leading with questions. So let's put it this way, there's a plethora of people out there that don't even know that they've mentored me, but they put another log on the fire, so to speak, uh, of building all that's a part of me today.
I love that. And that is so awesome. And it's so true. It's like many times you see the people who are leaders in their industry, they're just standing on the shoulders of the giants that went before them. And we really have, like King Solomon says, that in a multitude of counselors there is safety. So it's really a multitude of mentors that have
Yeah,
really helped us to get where we are. And I love
you
the
say that.
story that you shared with Bob and how he has an interesting collection, because that was the question I wanted to ask you, because it's powerful. I love that framework for how to get started learning how to ask great questions in 30 seconds for people who are just getting started. And I wanted to ask you, what about the people who've been studying about asking questions for a while? They consider themselves more students of the subject. And like for myself, I have chosen, and largely through your influence too, after seeing the value, I have chosen to dedicate my life to mastering the skill and the science and art of asking questions. So I'm curious if you could speak to the segment of our audience that is more advanced in asking questions. What tips would you give to an advanced or students who would like to master the skill of asking questions?
Again, that's a fabulous question, and I'm happy to share, my thoughts. I'd love to know your thoughts on this,
Okay.
because it's not like, okay, I have all wisdom on this one. Um, One of the things that I'm kind of a fan of is it relates to adult learning. Adult learning is actually giving people an opportunity to do what they're being trained to do. And so even in the seminars I do, one of the things is I give people opportunities to ask questions of each other, and knowing that the takeaway, in other words, if you only tell people to do stuff, even if they take notes, the chances of them actually doing it later are small. But if you give people an opportunity in the seminar to actually do what you want them to do when they leave, you increase the likelihood, because it's like, wow, that was easy. And they actually did it. They had experiential learning versus just intellectual learning. And I think, again, I'm repeating myself, adult learning to me is experiential learning, providing people those kind of opportunities. So that's one thought there. The second thought is I too have become a collector of questions. My first book, Great Leaders Ask Questions, a Fortune 100 list, and and I tell people, just start making a list. You know, the computer makes it so easy, of questions that you hear, that if you ask a question, somebody says that's a great question, write it down. But begin to make a list of potential questions. As that list grows, you can begin to categorize them into different areas of things. Um, but the second thing is, maybe it's the third now, is every time I like, wow, this is a great question, I want to give myself experiential learning. So I will, with great intention, look for somebody I can ask that question of. and in experience, asking and listening to it and using it. That's what cements it into me, is actually asking. The list by itself, if you never ask any of the questions on your list, I think is you could say, well, I have a collection of questions, but it's a bit like a fisherman who says, man, I have a collection of fishing poles or lures. Well, do you ever go fishing? Well, no, but I just have this collection. We kind of look at them like, why? And so in the same way, why have a collection of questions if you're not actually using them?
Yeah,
What do you think?
those are so solid. I love that. And well, for me, things that I have found is like what you were sharing is creating a collection and a list. In marketing, there's a concept that's called a swipe file. And like you said, the questions don't have to be your own. You could, if you find something that's great, you could borrow it and add to your collection and then start to categorize those. I've found that to be extremely helpful because even when you're starting to create a collection, it's increasing your awareness and you're becoming hyper aware when you're listening to great questions. You're like, oh, I want to add that to my collection. So that has been
Yeah.
really helpful. A second thing that I found that's beneficial for me is I made a commitment to myself that whenever I show up at a seminar, an event, a coaching program, or a mastermind that I've invested in, whenever there's opportunities for like sharing ahas or asking a question, or even when there's like speakers who they do a Q&A and there's like 1,000 people, 5,000 people in the audience, they're like, all right, time for questions. I will get up out of my seat and I'll go to the microphone and I will stand in line even before I know what question I'm going to ask. Because that level of discipline or that level of like commitment is like I'm standing there, I'm like the next person in line and I've got to figure out what I'm going to ask this person who I may never get another opportunity to ask this billionaire a question or whoever it is. And so that has helped me a lot. And I would say that even that habit in coaching programs that are online, I've actually developed a reputation where I'll be walking in the hallways at entrepreneurship events and they're like, hey, Enoch. And they come up to me and they're like, I wanted to meet you. You're the guy who asks great questions. Like I hear that all over the place in whatever programs I'm in
Wow.
because I'm
Yeah.
always showing up in the Q&A. And largely like you were the one who kind of spurred me on to that. So I thank you for that. I really appreciate it. The third thing
And
that,
can I make just
oh,
one comment
go
there?
for it.
Um, I'm guessing that many times, because you're jumping up immediately, you are the first person in line. And for any speaker, whenever they say, okay, question and answer, who has the first question? Do you know what they fear?
What do they fear?
Silence.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Somebody have a question? Anybody? And it's awkward,
It
very
is.
awkward for the speaker. And so, you know who they really appreciate? The first person that, especially if it's almost instant. Sir, I've got a question for you. And so when I'm in those same situations, Enoch, I'm actually thinking, even as they start speaking, if they have a question and answer, I want to be prepared to be that person because I actually know they're going to be so appreciative. Because when you say, hey, time for questions, many times that silence is deafening.
That is so true. That's a really good point. And now that you mention that, I never thought of that before. So, would you like to hear the last
Yes,
thing I found?
please,
So
please.
there's a chapter in my book that I talk about finding great mentors and starting what I call the reporter's platform. And that's a show, a podcast, a YouTube channel, something that you can invite experts or your mentors like yourself and start interviewing and being able to share those lessons that you've learned. So I find that like creating content and having a place where you can interview, there's really great opportunities to practice asking and
Oh,
mastering these. And once you have that content rhythm or you have a rhythm where you are interviewing people, then it's going to be like cause and effect. It's like many people that they're not bad at asking questions. They just haven't done it 100 times yet or 1,000 times yet.
sure,
And then you
sure.
start to get the repetitions in. So I found those to be helpful. So So while we're talking about great discoveries, what is something recent that you've recently had a new revelation of, something that's really been prominent on your mind lately relating to asking questions that you would like to share, or be intentional about kind of practicing or just saying something
Yeah.
that's been valuable for you in this subject?
Well, the thing that immediately comes to mind, and a question I love to ask people is, what are your favorite questions to ask? And
Mm.
recently, a new friend, we went to lunch, and I was saying, hey, what are your favorite questions to ask? And he said, well, Bob, I've got one. He said, it's going to seem so simple that it may surprise you. But he said, and he's a coach, and he said, the question I love to ask is, what are you wanting to accomplish here?
Mm.
He said, a lot of times the people I coach, come with a problem, a challenge, and they're saying, well, there's this here, and this is going on, and this is going on, and I don't know what to do about this. And he says, this question just seems to cut through all of that. And like, what are you trying to accomplish here? Cuts through all of that and brings them back to, what is it I'm wanting to accomplish? And a lot of times he said they can get their eyes off the prize by looking at all the other stuff and forget, oh, that's what I want to accomplish. And so that's kind of my latest find, is that question. What are we trying to accomplish here?
That is awesome. I absolutely love that. And that reminds me of a question that I just taught my students yesterday, which is, when you're on like a coaching session or in a sales call, when you're in a conversation, to ask in the very beginning, if this conversation was successful in every way, like what would we need to accomplish in order to meet your satisfaction? And they just front load all of their expectations and desires. As long as we make sure that we do that, then we can lead and serve in so many ways. I love that. That is great. And another question, as far as like when you're learning, because like you said, you're devouring books and you're listening to new learnings and developing your skills. When you're listening to a speaker, a podcast, or a book, how would you say that you listen to questions differently than, say, most students would?
Mm. Um, I'm guessing, and again, I'm thinking in my past, and this is true for so many leaders. I was an oblivion to the value of questions. There was just, oblivion is the right word. I'm sure I heard questions. I'm sure I was asked questions, but I was in oblivion in terms of realizing, wait a minute, them their questions are pure gold,
Mm-hmm.
and didn't see the value. Um, and so today, when I read, when I listen, when I interact, it's kind of like every time I hear a question, especially a great question, it's like, wow. Now, also, though, there's other times in which, again, if you watch news shows from time to time, you realize the reporter, there was a question mark at the end of his statement.
Yeah.
And I sometimes have fun with people. My blog is leading with questions, but it is not how to write or use leading questions. There's a whole lot of leading questions that isn't actually leading with questions.
Mm-hmm.
Enoch, I'm sure this is what you want to do, isn't it? It's not exactly, hey, Enoch, what do you think would be best here? Um, Kind of thing. You're thinking a few takeaways. There's a couple other really simple things. One of the things I talk about is, if you want to get better answers, you got to ask better questions. And Enoch, this next little thing I learned from a mother, but is so, so incredibly wise. Every day she was asking her daughter when she came home from school, honey, how was school today? Well, and guess what answer she got?
Good.
Good,
It was all
fine,
right.
boring, but one word, and the conversation is done. And yet the mother said, day after day, week after week, I kept asking that question and getting one word. Finally, it dawned on me, maybe I ought to come up with a better question. So our daughter comes home, and again, this is so simple. She said, honey, tell me about your day. And she said, at first, I didn't know if she actually heard me because there was kind of silence. And then she started talking, and for the next 5 minutes, she told me about her day. And, I say, how many times have we said to somebody, hey, how was your weekend? Oh, fine. Enoch, tell me about your weekend. And you get an answer. You don't get just fine. You could maybe, but I'm saying the probability is now you get a longer answer. And another little tip is what I call the power of might, M-I-G-H-T. We often, in asking, hey, Enoch, what do you think we should do here? People can be a bit hesitant to answer because it's like, I might give the wrong answer. This might not be the thing we should do. So I'm not sure that I know exactly what we ought to do here. So I say, I'm not sure, i.e., I'm not going to answer. But just changing the word, saying, hey, Enoch, what do you think we might do here? It's kind of like, oh, well, I can respond to that because the person asking the question isn't like there might only be one right answer. Just changing often to, hey, what might we do? Just creates more freedom for the person to say, well, I have a thought or two of something we might do. And it gets more response than what should we do? What might we do versus what should we do? Just a little tip.
Those are really awesome tips. I love that story about the mother, and it's so profound how just a simple tweak, like one question, could radically transform the relationship of the mother and the daughter, and just being able to touch bases like that. I mean, you could see the quality of her life and leadership as a parent could just be so much improved. I love that. And the might to be able to take off the pressure, to people feel more open to share without all that like expectation of having the right answer, but having the right question. That's cool. I love that. Thank you for sharing. And we're going to be wrapping it up here, but I'm curious, if you're talking to speakers, authors, coaches, people who speak to audiences and who are teaching and communicating ideas or frameworks or helping people to change behavior, why would you say that questions is a really important, why do you think questions is important for communicators in teaching?
I'm going to go back perhaps predictably. The greatest communicator in history, the Lord Jesus. When you study Jesus as a communicator, you begin to understand he focused on two things, two pillars of his communication. He told great stories. He asked great questions. And one day, I'm not a deep thinker, but one day I had this deep thought. And I was thinking, wait a minute. Yeah, we celebrate Jesus coming to earth, Christmas, but the scripture teaches that he has existed forever. And the scriptures also teach that Jesus was involved in creation. And the thought that came to me is wait a minute. Wouldn't we think that the person who can write a complicated computer code for a program might be the one who would know how to leverage his or her program to the max? Well,
most definitely.
Yeah, of course. You and I might use the program and discover we're only using 15% of its capacity. And there's so many bells and whistles we don't even know about. And but the thought was, wait a minute, might Jesus in his communication actually be leveraging the way in which he designed us? And I thought, wow, he told great stories. And stories are sticky. When we hear a great story without writing it down, without saying, oh, I need to memorize this so I could share it later, it just sticks. I wonder if Jesus knew when he told the story of the Good Samaritan that they'd go home remembering. Well, of course.
Absolutely.
And then he asked, as you said, 339 questions are recorded in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the NIV translation. And obviously, Jesus wanted to see people's lives changed. Might he have known that if you ask a question that allows them to come up with an answer to his question, that their answer to his question had a greater probability of changing them than if he said, Enoch, Bob, let me tell you what to think here.
Wow.
And it was like, well, of course. And the fact is, we actually can benefit from following the pattern. And so, in asking questions, like one of the things I do, it may not fit every speaker in terms of their topic, but like I did this morning in the 2 hour seminar, in each hour there was a conversation exercise. And in that conversation exercise, they ask each other, we put them just two people. If we're on Zoom, two people in a room, and we give them 8 minutes. They have 4 minutes each to ask this question. And on the first one, it's one of my favorite questions. What are the 3 to 4 events that have most shaped your life? And they have 4 minutes each to answer that. And when we bring them back, I always ask, I say, would it surprise you if I had a question for you? Of course, it doesn't surprise them. I say, how many of you would say you now know more about this person you just had this 8 minute conversation with, asking each other this question? You know more about them than some of your friends you've known for 20 years. Well, every hand goes up. And then I say, you know those friends you've known for 20 years? How could you find out what are the 3 to 4 events that most shape their lives? Well, of course, just ask. And so when I'm speaking, I like to do these conversation exercises because, like I said earlier, I think they then have an experience, and that experience makes this topic sticky. It's like I think many of these will leave today, that this morning, and we'll be looking in this next week for people to ask, hey, what would you say are the 3 to 4 events that have most shaped your life? Because they enjoyed it, but they saw the value of it, and they'll start using it.
Wow. That is so good. I love that question, that exercise, and it makes sense. And when you said that Jesus is a great pattern that we could follow, it reminds me of, like, I was reading Times Magazine, and they were talking about the top 10 most influential men in human history. And they said that Jesus Christ was the number one. This is a secular magazine, recognizing Christ was the most influential man throughout the beginning of time. And even if whether you're faith-based or not faith-based, like, anyone could learn a little something from a man who had 3.5 years of public like ministry, and he's been able to shape billions and billions of people's lives. Like, that's amazing. The greatest teacher this world has ever known. I remember the first time you said that, when I read that Jesus asked 339 questions and he only answered about 7 of them, I was like, wow. Just the ratio from how much, like, telling and asking he did, it really struck my heart, because I know he's influential. I know he's got the pattern and the plan, and when it comes to presenting and persuading or helping, it's there's no better example that we could pick up on some communication tips.
You know, Enoch, you and I ask a lot of questions because we don't know the answer. That's why we ask questions. Jesus never asked a question because he didn't know the answer. And
Wow.
And again, some of the most powerful, sometimes I say the story of the Good Samaritan. Do you recall how Jesus ended that story?
Yeah, he said, now which of these was this man's neighbor? It was with a question.
Now, you could say, Bob, that's not really a very difficult question. But let's go back to the context. He was speaking to a Jewish audience. And in that audience, all the Jewish people hated Samaritans. So
Mm-hmm.
I sometimes, when I'm speaking, I ask the audience, how many of you grew up in homes where your parents and grandparents hated Samaritans? Well, no one. In fact, if there was an athletic team called the Good Samaritans, we'd instinctively be for them.
Yeah, cheering them on.
But yeah, but Jesus told this story, making the hero of the story a member of this group that they hated. And so when he asked this question, who then was the neighbor? On one hand, Enoch, it was a simple question, like a first grader could have gotten the right answer here. It wasn't like, man, I got to think about this. But the Jewish man who answered had to think about it. And it is a curious answer that he gives. He doesn't actually say the Good Samaritan or the Samaritan. Do you recall what he says?
He, um, when he said, "Go and do thou likewise."
No, in this one, it was the one who showed mercy.
Oh,
The Jewish
yeah,
man said the one who showed mercy. Now,
that's right.
there's so many times, Enoch, I wish Paul Harvey was still around to get us the rest of the story. I'm curious what happened in the rest of that man's life through that interaction with Jesus, the Good Samaritan, being asked that question, giving that answer. What happened in his life the next day, the next week, the next year? We won't know until heaven, but I'm sure it was a powerful encounter that had a lasting result, I'm guessing, in that man's life. I can't prove it because there's no further story about him, but an example of a powerful question. On the other hand, such a simple question, but in the context, such a powerful question.
That is really powerful, and that example is so ripe and filled with meaning. And it's often like the smallest hinges that swing the largest doors. And it
Yeah.
just
Oh,
something so
love that
simple.
phrase.
Yeah. And I also want to say, like, back on that question, what is one of the 3 to 4 major events that have shaped your life? I want you to know that coming in contact with your books and reading your material has been one of the most impactful events in my life to
Wow.
help open up so many possibilities that I didn't even know at the time would be possible. And I'm really grateful that you put these together and you're making them available to everybody. And I'm so glad that you were willing to come on this show and I could share this with my audience because I fully support your mission. I believe in it. I'm excited that you are doing this. Leadingwithquestions.com is so powerful. And I'm glad that you're doing what you're doing. My last question is, how could our listeners get a copy of your new ebook?
Well, Annie, thanks for asking. First of all, everything I do on social media is free. And so subscribing to my blog is free. Go to leadingwithquestions.com, cursor down, there's a place to enter your email, click on subscribe, and you'll be subscribed. And twice a week into your inbox will come turnkey ready questions. You'll be joining leaders actually from 190 countries who are committed to increasing their leadership effectiveness. And then all of my books are free ebooks. Um, and 2 of them, Great Leaders Ask Questions, and now that's a great question. I've also recorded the audiobook on that, and that can be downloaded as a free audiobook MP3 to your smartphone and listen as you walk, run, drive, bike, or just sit in the rocking chair. um, but everything I do is free, and again, let me state this carefully. There are some people, and this isn't wrong, part of their business model is to give free ebooks, and in the ebook, they're selling something. That's not a wrong model, but I'm wanting to assure your listeners there is no sales pitch to sell anything in any of my books. What excites me, we all have heard kind of the MasterCard commercial where they add up the dollars, but then they say, but, you know, uh, the real thing here is that it's invaluable. And so what excites me is I Enoch, you have so encouraged me today. Hearing a story of somebody who has moved from let me tell you to let me ask you, and it's changed their leadership. Uh, like the MasterCard commercial, those are priceless. And those are the kind of things that, again, by God's grace, I seek to hear, to know that we've made a difference in a leader's life. And you've probably heard this statement: when a leader gets better, everybody wins.
Mm-hmm.
I know when a leader gets better, it's not just that he or she wins, but their staff are now better led. And that excites me. Also, for listeners who have friends who speak other languages as maybe their first language, my books, many of them are available in Spanish and French, Portuguese, Polish, Chinese, and soon coming will be Albanian. Also soon coming will be Romanian, Urdu, which is the language of Pakistan. Oh, they're also available in Farsi. So if you have friends that they would prefer those languages, or that's their native natural language, I think everybody enjoys reading in the language they first learned. They're available. All of that's free. Go to leadingwithquestions.com. On the top, you click on books and you'll see where you can download all of them.
That is awesome. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be able to speak with you. And what you say about when a leader gets better, everybody wins. It's so true, because before I came in contact with your questions and resources that you just generously provided for my audience, I was a poor missionary, homeless, living in my car. And it was shortly coming out of that, I came in contact with yours, started a business, and the Lord is blessed to being able to have a 6-figure family business of an online health food store, reaching thousands of people, transforming their healths because of some of the leadership lessons and abilities that you've provided, and for our team throughout that. And it truly is, you're making a ripple effect in the lives of everybody. And for those who are listening, as you start to get on the journey of mastering the art and skill of asking questions, there's no limit to the people that you're able to lead and impact through your influence. And it's just super exciting to be able to partner together on this interview. And I really appreciate your time. You've really given great value, and I'm so glad to have this and have you for this time. Thank you, Bob Tiede.
Well, Enoch, thank you for having me. I have a request to make of you.
Okay.
I'm always looking, just like you look for podcast guests, I'm always looking for guest post authors. And I know from just what you've interacted that you lead with questions. And so I'd love to have 1, 2, 3, or many over time guest posts from you. And kind of like I say, the goal of every post, whether mine or a guest post, is to provide our subscribers with a couple turnkey ready questions and wrap them in a story of how you found them, use them, the difference they make in people's lives. And what we're providing our subscribers is another question to put into their question toolbox.
Yeah, I love that. And thank you. It's an honor. I would be more than happy to be able to give some turnkey questions with stories, how they impact people. And I'd love to follow up with you on that. That sounds great. An answer to my prayers, and happy to go full circle and serve your audience as well.
Again, so grateful for this opportunity. This has been so much fun, Enoch.
Likewise. Thank you. And for those who are watching, this has been the Art of Asking Questions with Bob Tiede. Let me know in the comments, what have you found to be the most valuable takeaway that you got from this training. And remember, as always, remember that God doesn't call a qualified, he qualifies a called.